But the moment you walked away, and I mean really walked away, with no lingering hope, no emotional bait left dangling, that was the moment the narcissist was forced to confront something they spend their lives avoiding, their own irrelevance. Not to the world at large, perhaps, but to the person they thought they had ensnared indefinitely. Now, why is this so devastating to them? It's because narcissism is, at its core, a defense mechanism. A fragile ego hidden behind grandiosity or victimhood. The narcissist needs others to validate their existence, not in the usual human way, but in a much deeper pathological sense. You were never just a partner or a friend or a family member. You were a mirror, a reflection of their fabricated self-worth. As long as you were close, reactive, apologetic, seeking reconciliation, they could maintain the fiction that they mattered more than they truly did. But when your absence became reality, when you stopped calling, when your silence wasn't punishment but peace, they couldn't just miss you. They had to face themselves. That's the real tragedy of the narcissist. The person they've been running from their whole lives is the one who lives in the mirror when no one else is around. And that person is hollow, filled with shame, and incapable of love in its honest form. So the moment you left, the mask began to crack. Not because you took something away, but because your presence had always been a scaffolding. You held up their delusion. You played your role, perhaps unknowingly, for far longer than you should have. And when you exited this stage, the entire set collapsed. There's a psychological term for this kind of moment, narcissistic injury. It's when the narcissist's false self is threatened or exposed, and nothing exposes them quite like being left by someone they believed was permanently under their influence. You were supposed to stay. You were supposed to keep hoping. You were supposed to keep doubting yourself, but you didn't. And that wasn't part of the script. This is where the power of your choice becomes undeniable. Because true power, real personal sovereignty, often looks uneventful on the surface. You may have left quietly, maybe you didn't yell, maybe you didn't even explain, but that calm final decision carries more weight than all the chaos that preceded it. It's the kind of silence that echoes. And the narcissist hears it loudest when there's no one left to manipulate. Understand this clearly. They weren't broken because you hurt them. They were broken because you stopped letting them hurt you. You reclaimed your agency. You drew a boundary that wasn't up for negotiation. And you made a decision rooted not in revenge, but in clarity. That kind of strength is disarming to someone who relies on confusion, on doubt, on emotional instability. It renders them powerless, not because you took their power, but because they never had any to begin with. They only ever borrowed yours. And so when you walked away, not in rage, but in resolve, they knew. Maybe not intellectually, maybe they didn't say it, but something in them knew. The game was over. Not because you ended it, but because you outgrew it. And that's the kind of loss they can't recover from. Because they don't know how to grow in your absence. They only knew how to survive in your shadow. And that ultimately is what broke them. When you stopped reacting, something extraordinary happened. Something subtle on the surface, but seismic beneath it. The narcissist felt it. And I don't mean felt it in the way a person feels disappointment or rejection. I mean something deeper, more disorienting. The narcissist lives on reaction. Your emotional responses, whether anger, confusion, hurt, or even love, are their lifeblood. As long as you were reacting, you were engaged in their psychological ecosystem. You were feeding it. But when your reactions ceased, when you began responding with neutrality, with silence, with detachment, they lost the signal they rely on for their own sense of identity. It's a strange thing, isn't it? Most people assume that emotional detachment is a weakness, a kind of shutting down. But in this context, it's actually an evolution. Because to reach the point where you're no longer provoked, where the barbs don't penetrate, the gaslighting doesn't confuse, and the drama doesn't entice, you've crossed an invisible threshold. You've reclaimed something essential, your sovereignty. And that's precisely what the narcissist cannot tolerate. Why? Because to the narcissist, your emotions are not your own. They're tools. They see them as levers they can pull at will, make you angry, make you cry, make you apologize, make you doubt yourself. But when you stop reacting, they lose those levers. And without control, they feel irrelevant. That's their greatest fear. Not abandonment, not rejection, but irrelevance. Your indifference isn't just a mood, it's an existential threat. Here's the philosophical irony of this situation. Your growth, your movement toward psychological maturity, becomes their undoing. The very process that should be celebrated, this evolution toward emotional responsibility and inner peace, is what causes their internal world to begin unraveling. Because now you're not playing the game. And when the narcissist can't provoke a reaction, they're faced with a terrifying possibility that they never had the power they thought they did. There's something deeply human about the need to be seen. We all share it. But the narcissist takes it a step further. They need not only to be seen, but to be reacted to, and not on equal terms. They need to generate emotion in others to feel alive themselves. But that strategy comes with a fatal flaw. If someone they once controlled develops emotional autonomy, if that person no longer gives them the response they crave, they're confronted by a void, not just a social absence, but a metaphysical one. A collapse in meaning. You see, meaning for the narcissist is externally derived. They build themselves through manipulation. Their self-position is constructed, not discovered. They don't explore the depths of their psyche for truth. They manufacture a persona and then use others as mirrors to reinforce it. So your silence, your peace, is not just the end of a relationship dynamic. It's a refutation of their entire identity. Think about that. You didn't just stop reacting, you stopped affirming their existence as they defined it. You moved out of their orbit. And when that happened, their gravitational pull weakened. You changed the rules of the universe they believed they rule. This is not to say your journey was easy. Reaching a point of non-reactivity likely required years of pain, confusion, and growth. Maybe you cried yourself to sleep countless times. Maybe you questioned your sanity, but slowly you began to see. You began to understand. And in that understanding, you found stillness. And in that stillness, the narcissist saw something that truly shook them. Not rage, not defiance, but composure. And composure, for someone who thrives on chaos, is the clearest signal of all that their power has ended. So what do you do with that? You hold it. You guard it. Because the ability to respond instead of react is a sign of self-possession. And once you've tasted that, you don't give it away again. Not for anyone. Especially not for someone who only ever wanted to keep you emotionally enslaved. The truth is, when you stopped reacting, you did more than confuse the narcissist. You rendered them obsolete. And in that quiet, you didn't just find peace, you reclaimed your power. When you began setting boundaries, real boundaries, ones enforced not with anger or threat, but with quiet resolve, it sent a shockwave through the narcissist's world. You see, to someone with narcissistic tendencies, boundaries are not perceived as necessary guidelines for healthy interaction. They're seen as obstacles, as limits on their perceived entitlement to your time, your attention, your empathy, and perhaps most importantly, to your pain. Because pain to them is leverage. If they can touch it, they can use it. But something shifted. Maybe it happened gradually. You started saying no, not with rage or apology, but with conviction. You no longer explained yourself or sought their permission to feel what you felt. You stopped bending to accommodate their unpredictable moods or rewriting your reality just to preserve the peace. Instead, you began telling the truth, not necessarily to them because you already knew how that would be received, but to yourself. And that's the foundation of every real boundary. Truth. This was not rebellion, it was recovery, a reclamation of your psychological territory. And that, more than anything else, unsettled the narcissist. Because it meant you were no longer a psychological extension of them. You were not reacting to every mood shift, not internalizing their blame, not absorbing their guilt. You were becoming a person in your own right. And in the narcissist's world, Autonomy is a betrayal. There's a reason for this. Narcissists rely on enmeshment. They blur the lines between self and other. They don't just want control, they want fusion. Your identity becomes secondary to the role you serve in their self-narrative. That might be the caretaker, the scapegoat, the admirer, whatever suits their needs. But it's never about who you actually are. So when you introduce boundaries, you introduce separation. And separation to the narcissist feels like annihilation. What's fascinating psychologically is that this confrontation with your boundaries isn't merely frustrating to the narcissist, it's humiliating because they believed they had control. They believed they had shaped you so thoroughly that you would never risk upsetting the fragile equilibrium of their approval. But you did, and in doing so, you exposed the lie they tell themselves, that they are all-powerful, indispensable, above reproach. Your boundaries said, you don't get to define me anymore. And that message, delivered through calm and consistent action, is what ultimately pierced the illusion. The more you held those boundaries, the more you began to experience something strange. Less fear, less guilt, less confusion, because boundaries don't just protect you from others, they clarify who you are. They function like the fences around a home, not walls to keep people out necessarily, but structure to let the right ones in, and to know where you end and someone else begins. And that's essential when recovering from narcissistic abuse, which often involves a slow erosion of self-concept. Your sense of I becomes obscured under the weight of manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional instability. So the reestablishment of boundaries is, in effect, a rebirth of the self. Not the reactive self, not the pleaser or the performer, but the self that chooses deliberately and freely. That's what the narcissist didn't handle. Not just that you were leaving or changing or growing, but that you were doing it without their input, without their approval, that you had decided to write a different story and didn't need their signature at the bottom. Of course, they may have pushed back. They often do. Accusations, guilt trips, sudden love bombings, all tactics designed to weaken the boundary and reinstate control. But you didn't bend this time. That was the moment everything changed. Because a boundary, once held consistently, sends a message louder than any confrontation. I belong to myself now. And in that truth lies the beginning of your freedom. Not freedom from pain, because there is pain in breaking free. Not freedom from memory, but freedom from subjugation. From the slow spiritual erosion that occurs when you're constantly adjusting yourself to survive someone else's emotional volatility. So what happened when you drew the line and held it? The narcissist recognized, whether consciously or not, that their influence was over. And perhaps for the first time, you were no longer afraid of who you might be without them. Boundaries are not a wall to keep love out. They are the doors. When you stopped explaining yourself, something profound happened, perhaps more profound than you even realized at the time. You reclaimed your authority, not over others, but over yourself. You stepped outside of the cycle, that endless pattern of justification, clarification, and appeasement that narcissists so skillfully manipulate to maintain control. And in doing so, you disrupted a dynamic they believed would last forever. You see, the narcissist depends on your need to be understood. They feed off your compulsion to make things make sense, to defend your actions, to correct their misinterpretations, to prove that your intentions were good. But this is the trap. Every time you try to explain yourself, you're conceding that their perception matters more than your reality. You're trying to win a game they designed with rules that shift the moment you start to gain ground. And the moment you opt out of that game, they feel it deeply. Psychologically, this moment marks a turning point in identity differentiation. It's a fancy way of saying you stop merging your sense of worth with someone else's perception of you. Narcissists tend to weaponize misrepresentation. They twist your words, distort your motives, and then demand that you clean up the mess they made, often while convincing you that it was your mess in the first place. When you stop engaging in that cleanup, You're signaling something powerful, that their narrative no longer holds jurisdiction over your truth. What makes this so difficult and why so few people can do it cleanly is that it requires a radical shift from external validation to internal anchoring. You have to stop needing them to see you clearly. And that's hard, especially if the relationship was long-term or involved intense emotional enmeshment. There's a grief in realizing that someone you cared for never truly saw you and perhaps never wanted to. But on the other side of that grief is liberation. The narcissist, of course, experiences your silence not as indifference, but as defiance. Because silence in this context is not passive, it is not a retreat. It is a firm refusal to hand over your psychological energy to a black hole of manipulation. And the narcissist, who thrives on emotional reaction, suddenly finds themselves in a vacuum. No outrage, no justifications, no desperate attempts to patch the cracks in their narrative. Just stillness, just absence, just you, standing apart, untouched. This hits them where it hurts most. Because the narcissist's identity is performative. It's not grounded in introspection, but in reflection. Specifically, the reflection you provide when you engage. When you stop mirroring back their distorted worldview, when you no longer confirm their superiority or cater to their fragility, they're left staring into a mirror that no longer shows them anything. That emptiness terrifies them. It's worth noting that this isn't about adopting stoicism for the sake of pride. This is about the strength it takes to choose peace over chaos. Not the performative peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep, unshakable peace that comes from no longer needing to prove who you are. You begin to recognize that you are not obligated to explain your values, your choices, your boundaries to someone who has demonstrated they're not interested in understanding you, only in controlling you. And there's a deeper layer to this. The more you stop explaining, the more you begin to trust yourself. You realize you were never actually crazy. You were manipulated to feel uncertain. You were gaslit into believing your reactions were overreactions. But the moment you stopped justifying your emotions, you began to validate them. That shift from external explanation to internal affirmation is how self-respect is born. Not in theory, but in practice. When the narcissist saw that you no longer felt compelled to explain yourself, they recognized, perhaps more clearly than ever, that you were gone. Maybe not physically, not yet, but emotionally, psychologically, you had detached. Their words no longer pierced. Their accusations no longer stirred self-doubt. You were no longer an actor in their script. And that is the precise moment they began to lose the control they once took for granted. Because in the end, strength isn't about being louder, it's about being still. It's about knowing who you are even when others misrepresent you, especially then. And that kind of strength, the quiet, stable kind, is the one thing a narcissist cannot counterfeit and cannot destroy. One of the most unnerving things for the narcissist is witnessing the moment when you begin to protect your peace more fiercely than you protect their ego. It's a profound reversal. For so long, your emotional energy was funneled into keeping things smooth, avoiding conflict, managing their reactions, and cushioning their fragile self-concept. You walked on eggshells, edited yourself mid-sentence, rehearsed your tone before you spoke, not because you were weak, but because you were deeply conditioned to maintain stability at any cost. And they relied on that. It wasn't just convenient for them, it was foundational. But when that dynamic starts to shift, when you begin to place your psychological well-being above their approval, it doesn't just throw off the balance, it threatens the very structure of the relationship. Narcissists often operate within a very rigid framework of dominance and validation. They dominate emotionally, psychologically, sometimes even spiritually, and they expect validation as their reward for doing so. But when you stop giving it, when you begin choosing stillness over reaction, solitude over drama, authenticity over appeasement, that's when the ground begins to crack beneath their feet. There is something incredibly telling in how they respond to your boundaries. When you start saying no without apology, when you start walking away from circular arguments, when you no longer rise to the bait of their provocations, that is when they realize they are no longer the center of your emotional life. And that realization is devastating to them because your emotional availability was their playground. It was where they performed, provoked, and pulled strings. When you protect your peace, you close the playground. From a psychological standpoint, this is a monumental shift. It marks the emergence of self-agency, what Carl Jung might have described as the movement from shadow to self. You stop outsourcing your stability to an unstable person. You begin to realize that calmness isn't something they grant you when they feel generous. It's something you claim for yourself when you become serious about your own healing. And this shift doesn't happen all at once. It's incremental. It's the quiet decision to walk away from a pointless argument. It's the internal reminder that their rage is not your responsibility. It's the refusal to explain your choices to someone who has never once respected them. Now, of course, they don't take this lightly. The narcissist may escalate. They may try harder, pushing buttons, bringing up the past, throwing out wild accusations, or playing the victim card. Why? Because peace, to them, is not neutral. It's threatening. Your calm signals detachment. And detachment signals a loss of control. And loss of control, they may accuse you of being cold, selfish, unloving. But here's the paradox. Protecting your peace is the most loving thing you can do. First for yourself and then for others who rely on you to be whole, grounded, and present. Because every ounce of energy you pour into a narcissist dysfunction is energy taken from your own clarity, your own growth, your own potential. Peace isn't a luxury. It's the soil in which all meaningful transformation is rooted. And it's here that a kind of emotional sobriety takes hold. You stop needing the highs and lows, the chaos masquerading as connection. You begin to prefer the quiet. You begin to value peace more than intensity, honesty more than charm, presence more than performance. And as you make that shift, the narcissist feels it. Not just emotionally, but existentially. Because without your emotional availability, their facade begins to falter. Their performance loses its audience. In this way, your strength becomes not just a rejection of their behavior, it becomes a mirror in which they're forced to see the hollowness behind their power plays, the emptiness of their manipulations, the fragility of their identity. And that mirror, held steadily by someone who no longer flinches, is unbearable. So if you've reached that point, if you've chosen to protect your peace, even when it meant disappointing them, confronting their anger, or walking away from their approval, understand this: you've done something profoundly courageous. You've placed your soul above their ego. And in doing so, you've chosen life over illusion.